Now it's my pleasure to introduce David McCullough. One of the themes of Yana is generation to generation. And when you hear the name McCullough, it's one of those just kind of the storied names in the Yale Pantheon. But what David has done with the American Exchange Project, just in his own right, is just really remarkable. We're kind of proud because, I don't know, Rachel, we were introduced to David when I think the American Exchange Project was kind of just maybe a little more than a napkin sketch. And when you hear what he's done tonight, we're going to see the video. It's just remarkable the impact he's had and the lives that he's changed. So how about a big Yana welcome for David McCullough?
I owe a thank you back to Yana. I was in touch with Rachel and Ken. I was fresh out of college. I was living on the fold-out couch in my parents' attic, not the most glamorous digs for a 24-year-old, with a big idea. And they said, great, let's work on it together. And we're in over 60 high schools across the country with 100 people on our staff right now, thanks to the work we did in those early days. It's a thrill for me to be here tonight. Coming back to you, I talk all over the country now and rarely among friends, but to see Khalid, who's here, I've been friends with for more than a decade, Yana friends, Yale folks, it feels at home. First of which is to point out my great mentor. I think there are few people who have the power to totally change the future for a young person than great teachers. And sitting to my right tonight is without question the teacher who shaped my life the most at Yale, my dear mentor, head of Davenport College, Ryan Brasso. Not only was he my thesis advisor when I was a senior, but I was also his research assistant on his book at the same time, which made it kind of like the nerd equivalent of mutually assured destruction. Now that he's working with AEP, I'm wondering how we're going to create the same sort of. Anyway, I wanted to share with you tonight a little bit about our organization, but also to couch it in a story about Yale and how so many of us who've had the great fortune of being associated with the university are in privileged positions to make great change. And while that is a wonderful place to be and is a very easily lends to one's passions and chasing one's heart, I encourage us all to think strategically about how we ought to put that privilege to good use, especially at a time when there are so many issues. The one I'm focusing on at AEP is division in America of all kinds. It's no great secret that our country is very divided right now. That conjures up political images, I think, in most folks' heads at the moment, which is where we see most division on the news. However, it is in all forms of society, from economic inequality, racial divisions, cultural divisions of all kind. In a few weeks, I'll be heading out to the state of Oregon, where 12 counties in the eastern part of Oregon are voting to secede and become part of the state of Idaho. Yes, I'm not kidding. They want out. Movements like that are happening across the country. To give you a quick sense, 35% of Americans believe the country would be better off if people on the other side, defined however they want it to be, just died. Half of our nation's young people think there'll be a civil war at some point in the next decade. Secession is of talks, even voting on in many states, like I just spoke about in Oregon. I find it interesting, though, that at the same time, 3/4 of white Americans don't have a friend who's not white. 40% of Americans have never met a farmer. And the number 2 and 3 predictors of how one voted in 2020 in the presidential election was your level of education and the population density of the precinct you voted in. Party was number 1, quite understandable. In other words, where you live and who you hang out with. The least likely group of people to get married today, for example, less likely than Red Sox and Yankees fans, are Democrats and Republicans. 4% of new marriages, used to be 40 in the 1960s. My thesis, or my belief, is that we're not spending enough time together and that we are ever more clustering into homogeneous pods in this country and defining our tribes and our groups with prejudice against the other, prejudice that is so often fueling ignorance. And if we can have connections with people who are different from us, we'll see a level of humanity and kinship that we are sorely missing right now. I run a nonprofit called the American Exchange Project. We are our nation's first free domestic youth exchange program. We send kids from Boston to Dodge City, Kansas, Muskogee, Oklahoma, to Palo Alto, California. And instead of fearing the other, we say, let's have an adventure. It's not who wants to empathize with a Republican, it's who wants to be a cowboy for a week. Let's go see what those Democrats have to say. Who cares? Let's go throw lobster traps into the Casco Bay. We've been operating for a handful of years now. Right now, we are shifting into our third week of the summer with 500 kids traveling across the country. I'll tell you more about that. But I brought a little video along tonight, one that we've had some help editing in the room here. Thank you very much. Found that out earlier. This is what AEP looks like.
We all crave connection. We all want to know we belong. This way, we learn from each other, support one another, and work together to fix our shared problems.
But divisions have defined the moment. The differences that could be our strength now polarize us.
Too often, though, we shun each other because we don't know each other. We need to rediscover our shared humanity, and young people can lead the way.
What if students from Palo Alto and the Bronx got to taste the best barbecue in Kilgore, Texas?
What if teenagers from Jackson, Mississippi and Jackson, Georgia could summit a Rocky Mountain or brave the Salmon River?
Or if kids from Sheridan, Wyoming and Dodge City, Kansas could cross the Brooklyn Bridge?
What if we all had the chance to make a lifelong friend from a faraway place?
What if American adulthood began with an adventure that brought us all closer together?
The American Exchange Project. We send high school seniors in the summer after graduation on a free week-long trip to an American town radically different from their own.
Travelers stay with open-hearted host families, soak up local culture, cheer, and come to love a new community and the people who call it home.
Connecting a country,
One student,
One high school,
One hometown at a time.
In the fall of 2015, the coaches on the Yale baseball team informed me that the potent combination of a hurt shoulder and no talent had me fresh off the Yale baseball team. And in an effort to fill the gap that the game had left in my life, it was my every neuron, many hours a day for about 20 years. I kind of scrambled around our wonderful university figuring out what I wanted to do. So I started acting in shows, I started writing for the newspaper, I started helping professors with their books, and I fell into a program some of you may know, particularly some of the younger alumni here, called the Studies in Grand Strategy. And I was informed by a friend in the Davenport Library one day that you had to apply to the course, which was a shocker to me. I'd already applied to Yale. I got in. Why do I need to keep applying things? And that as part of the application, I needed to come up with a summer research project on some aspect of grand strategy, whatever that meant. The day before, I had been interviewing a teacher at Wilbur Cross High School who, as part of a series I was writing for the YDN about life in New Haven. I went to Yale at a time where lots of students were protesting issues having to do with race and oppression and inequality. And while I thought the aims of the protests were fantastic, it bothered me that students at Yale and in my class knew so little about what was going on 2 blocks off campus in New Haven, where those issues were manifesting themselves for real people every single day. And I saw a real opportunity for us kids to get involved. I thought by writing stories for the newspaper, I could raise some interest about great things and needed areas in the city. And in the middle of my interview with Mrs. Sasso, she was the longtime English teacher there, she started crying, not prompted by any sort of question that was particularly deep or emotional. And she said, "David, nobody listens." So what do you mean, Mrs. Sasso? She said, "Nobody listens to teachers." She said, "People come into my school all the time, and we're the 3rd worst performing school in the state of Connecticut. And they tell me what to do. And they never say, Mrs. Sasso, you've been at the front of your classroom for 30 years. What should we be telling you to do? What would work well?" And I thought that was very interesting. So a day later, I'm applying for the Grand Strategy course and I have to come up with a project. And so I say that I'm going to borrow my mom's car this summer and I'm going to drive around the country and I'm going to talk to teachers in some of the schools that are in some of the poorest towns in America. And I at one time was chasing a real interest and passion. At another, admittedly, I was 21. I saw free money. I'm taking a road trip. Let's have some fun. And they went for it. And before I knew it, June 6th, day after my 22nd birthday, I was in my mom's Mazda and I spent the summer of 2016 driving 7,100 miles across America. I spent weeks in Cotulla, Texas, 60 miles north of the Mexican border, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, and in some of the more blighted neighborhoods of Cleveland, Slavic Village, and Huff, if anybody knows that city. Each of those areas had been through tough times and had a series of statistics and realities that had to do with poverty that were shocking. I don't have time to get into it now. I also know that cocktail hours at 7:30, so I want to be brief here. I don't want to stand in between you guys in that for too long. And for a kid from the suburbs of Boston who was going to a school like Yale, it was a world away from the one I knew, and yet part of my own country. And the lessons I learned, no offense to my teachers, were by far the most profound educational experience I'd had in my entire life. And the friends I made have to this day still remain strong. In fact, in their bolo ties and hats and boots off the airplane at Logan Airport. And 3 of my Cotulla pals were at my wedding 9 months ago, sitting in the front row. They were very popular. They taught everyone how to line dance during and I did all of that in the fated summer of 2016 as the Trump and Clinton campaigns were making their way around the country. And months later, when Donald Trump was elected president and everyone in my world of Boston and Yale couldn't figure out why, I was the one in the front row of lecture halls and at the Thanksgiving dinner tables raising my hand and saying, well, hop in my mom's car and I'll go show you. I also saw in my friendships and in the real people I was meeting a narrative about our country that was very contradictory to the polarizing narrative that we saw coming to the fore and that we really see burning hot today. So I went off to graduate school in 2018 and I came back wanting very much to serve my country, but wondering how best to do that at a time when it seemed like the greatest threats to our democracy were not foreign, but domestic. And when a lot of the ideas to combat the other side, whichever side you were on, seemed like they weren't going to work and they weren't going to really be a long-term fix to what the problem actually was. And I went to lunch with a Yale professor who was part of that grand strategy program, Paul Solomon, who's the economics correspondent for the PBS NewsHour and as a Yale professor in the economics department. And we went out to lunch and got to talking about the issue of division. It was 2018. At that point, many of the lecture halls and seminar classrooms of the world were obsessing over why so many first world democracies were dividing. This was the time of Brexit, the yellow vests in France, Bolsonaro in Brazil, far-right parties in Germany and Denmark and Sweden, and why populism and extremism and polarization was so consistently on the rise all over the world and utterly stymieing, grinding to a halt the governments of countries that could create tremendous progress for the world. And we really agreed that that was the worst problem in the world at the time. When we were talking about what we were learning in the schools that I'd been to as a student and the universities he'd been teaching at as a professor. And we both arrived at the notion that there was a real problem, because when it came in the lectures to the portions of the lecture where they might talk about a solution, no one had a clue what to do. And so that day we started 2 pals shooting the breeze over dumplings, throwing ideas out on the table. And he would throw an idea he'd been working on, Paul had, and I would kind of correct it. And in the middle of that, Paul held his hand up, stopped me in my tracks and said, David, if you want to do this, I'm on board. And for whatever reason, my heart kicked in at that moment and said, that's what you need to do with your life. I ran home, then tried to explain all that to my parents, which, having not been talking about it for 5 years, I didn't do a very good job of. And they kind of went, okay, right. Well, understood that I need a place to stay. They offered the attic. I folded out the fold-out couch, dusted off the plastic folding table in the corner, called that world headquarters for 3 years, and there made my home. And very quickly, I became the kid coordinating a massive research project into what social innovation can scale up right now and bring a divided country back together. And again, I don't mean just political. I think they're all class, politics, race, ethnicity, education. It's all very interrelated. And during that time, we learned a few key lessons about how to bring people who are divided against each other together. The first of which is that it helps a lot for folks who are in conflict to do a fun thing that can create socialization. The kicker, though, is that you can't market that thing. In other words, you can't attract these groups to the table on a, hey, everybody, let's come together pitch. Because at the very most, only the people who are going to want to do that are going to show up. They're arguably not really the problem. We also realized that a lot of adults who were very passionate about their political opinions, when digging into where those opinions were coming from, were not necessarily talking from places of logic or reason or rote debate. And that was as true on the left as it was on the right. They were talking from deeply personal experiences from their past. And just because I went to Andover, Yale, and Cambridge and had done all the research in the world, I wasn't going to change your mind from what your pastor told you when you were 4 years old, who's been the most important person in your life. And so we realized that when you're working in the space of conflicting opinions and ideas and beliefs, you're really not working with people's heads, you're working with their hearts. And that's a very, very important notion. And we realize within that there's nothing everybody loves more than their own children. And adults, we found, a very great way into changing their minds was to open the minds of their children. This occurred to me at my sister's soccer game. My sister, when she was 4 years old, decided she wanted to play soccer. My parents had never played soccer. They went down to the road to the local yard sale for $4. They bought her shin pads and cleats, drove her down to Manoa Park in Hawaii, where I grew up, and said, Leah, don't touch the ball with your hands and kick the ball in the other team's net. And that's all we know about soccer. She kicked the ball in the other team's net 14 times that day. Fast forward 15 years, and she's the captain of the Georgetown women's soccer game. My dad is in the front row of the stands yelling why that girl from DePaul was completely offsides. And that can't make any sense. And the ref had totally had his head up as you know what. Our family became a soccer fan. We're into the World Cup every year now. And the thought was then, well, what if we started working with young people? As many of you know, starting a nonprofit is not the most lucrative thing to do with one's life. So I, at the time, to earn a little income, was substitute teaching at the high school in my own hometown of Massachusetts. One
I'm
day,
listening to a really good webcast about.
Thank you, Thomas.
Oh, sorry.
So at the time, I was substitute teaching, and I fell into conversation with a group of students in my hometown, which is a white collar, mostly liberal suburb west of Boston, Sudbury, Massachusetts. Those know the area. And I started talking to these two students in the front row about the places I was traveling to as part of our research project. Places like Lake Charles, Louisiana, and Davenport, Iowa, and Kilgore, Texas, and Cotulla, Texas. And I noticed as I was talking to two students in the front of the room, every other voice around the room that was chatting, not paying attention to us, went quiet and started listening to me. And then they started peppering me with questions that were of an intellectual level that I had not seen in the 5 months that I've been substitute teaching at that school and coaching the high school's baseball team. And so I asked kids in Sudbury, Massachusetts, this affluent suburb of Boston, the same question I asked kids out on the road in 2016. What's your least favorite thing about where you're growing up? In other words, what's the issue on the top of your mind every day? And ironically, these kids said the exact same thing as kids in Cotulla and Pine Ridge and Cleveland and Davenport, Iowa, and Lake Charles, Louisiana, and Kilgore, Texas. I feel like I'm growing up in a bubble, and I've never seen life outside the bubble. If you think about those data points I mentioned earlier in the talk, and the homogeneity of the majority of American communities today, kids feel like they're growing up in bubbles because they are growing up in bubbles. They're massively different depending on what kind of bubble you're in, but the opportunity to interact with people who are different from them is dwindling, if not gone altogether. And I was 24 at the time, and my friends were all fresh out of college. And I thought back to my own pals who were seniors at that very same high school not long ago. And I realized that all of my friends and I, we all went to the same sorts of colleges pretty much. We were all in relationships with people from that high school or those colleges. All of my friends were working at one of the same 5 or 6 companies that had an office in the same district of Boston. They were all living in Southie, and they were all saving money to move back to a suburb like the one that we grew up in. So it wasn't just that they were living in bubbles, they were kind of on railroad cars, predestined. And the kids that I was getting to know in a lot of the communities I was working in were in their same sort of deal. So it's not only that they weren't interacting, it's that they probably never would. And that would create a huge problem for our democratic project. So at that moment, the light bulb, we thought, well, why not go live in a different bubble for a while? And when we looked at where exchange programs came from, it so happens that they are actually post-World War II conflict resolution tools, mostly funded by the State Department and by the European Union. American Field Service is in the building tonight. AFS was founded in 1946. It was an ambulance corps during World War I and World War II, and they noticed that the teenagers were becoming friends across international lines. And then in 1946, They started sending Americans to high school in Germany and Germans to high school in America. 1950, the Fulbright program was born. At the end of his life, Senator Fulbright said it was the greatest thing he did in his decades as a senator. By the end of the 1970s, you had hundreds of thousands of students traveling all over the world to study and hundreds of thousands of foreign-born students coming to America to study. It became in the 60s especially a great kind of tool to work with countries that were at threat of falling to communism. Peace Corps jumped out of that too. By the 1980s, the EU started the Erasmus program, which in now almost 35 years has funded 10 million students to study abroad within Europe to create a more cohesive European identity. The EU funds that at over $4 billion a year. This whole market for study abroad has really blossomed. I go and lecture in colleges today, and I say, show of hands who's been in a study abroad program, a third of the hands in the room go up. I say, now show of hands who's been to another country, every hand in the room goes up. 60 years ago, I bet one or two tops, and that's at the university level, let alone high school. Most of those kids are freshmen, sophomores. We thought, why not have the same thing right here in America? Why not, as part of the senior year of high school, send kids to towns that are very different from their own? And we had that idea in 2019, not knowing that we would be the geniuses that started the traveling program during the pandemic. So we went online like everybody else did, into dry dock. We tried to figure out if there was some sort of Zoom exchange program to be done. And no offense to the Zoomers tonight, it's just not the same as in person. What we ended up doing, though, was a kind of moderated Zoom program with kids where they were interacting and hanging out. And it became a great kind of test to see the do's and don'ts of getting kids who are from very different backgrounds and walks of life in this country together. And there are do's and there are don'ts, and I can get into them more later when we've got a little more time. And then in 2021, the pandemic eased up and we thought we'd pilot the program. So we sent 20 students on exchanges, 11 from Wellesley, Massachusetts and Palo Alto, California on trips to Lake Charles, Louisiana and Kilgore, Texas, rural conservative South. And then we sent 9 students from those 2 towns in the South up to the coasts in the second week. The test was, will they get along or will it be Coca-Cola and Mentos? Happily, they got along. There were a lot of interesting moments on the trip. One I'll highlight. We sent our kids from Wellesley, Massachusetts to the South in week 1. In week 2, we sent our kids up north. The Boston Globe caught wind of the program and had us on the front page. Imagine being a kid on your first trip out of home, and there's your face on the front page of the Boston Globe in the city that you're arriving in. You're wondering, who are these Southerners walking around Wellesley, Mass? They walk in to tour the local high school for the first day, and their friends who had been with them the week before were giddy with excitement, like a little kid who can't wait to show the dinner guests my room and my new toys that I just got for my birthday. It was all that same thing. One girl even wore rollerblades because she wanted to rollerblade up and down the hallway of the high school because no one was there. And they fell into conversation with the principal who let us in the front door that morning, who was really in the middle of a struggle with the local parents over building lights to the football stadium. The Wellesley High can only play their football games on Saturdays. Everybody else plays on Friday night. It's a huge point of contention. Folks in the neighborhood don't want the annoyance of dealing with late Friday night lights. And imagine kids from Texas, where there are 5,000 kids at the football game, hearing that. And they thought, our local parents support the team. They don't try to make them play on Saturdays. And he said, yeah, welcome to Wellesley. So well, don't they care about the town? And he says, yes, but most people move here when their kids are little and then they leave after the last kid just graduated from high school. They go to downtown Boston or they head down to Cape Cod or something like that. And that was totally foreign to Kilgore and Lake Charles kids because those students, their families have been there for 5, 6, 7 generations. My point at AEP is that we're never going to be able to talk politics unless we understand these dynamics about one another. And the kids knew that. So the tour begins, and these kids from Lake Charles and Kilgore, which are working class, very poor towns, start walking around the Maserati of American public schools, flush with pottery studios and metal art studios and Emerson quotes on the wall and every kind of politically forward flag that would never be allowed in Louisiana or Texas hanging from the wall. And a whole section of the old high school building that had been grafted into the wall of the new library to convey history. And within 15 minutes, the kids were crying because it was so unfair. They get this, we got what we got. And the kicker of that moment that was so fantastic was that because the kids from Wellesley had been to the South the week before, they saw tears in the eyes of their friends and knew exactly what they were crying about. And the little kid demeanor went away, and immediately they felt really bad. And when the kids from the South saw their friends realizing how they were feeling, and they felt heard, they said, "We just heard from your principal that you didn't pick to be born here. You didn't pick to live in Wellesley." And what could have been a huge moment of animosity because of the privileges some people get and others don't, ended up being an open conversation about what do we do with the privileges we've been born with. And the kids in Lake Charles even said, our high school is this to other high schools in our own city. And I'm now wondering what I can do about that, because I'm sure they feel that way about me. That's kind of what happens when these interactions go well. I'm delighted to report that we're now in our 4th summer. We have 500 kids in the program, 63 exchanges, 100 people on the payroll. We've been in over 100 media outlets all over the world. I was told by one of our funders that we're the only program to be featured on Fox and Friends and Good Morning America in the same week. When that happened in the spring, I was like, it's working. Yes. We were the cover story on the CBS Sunday Morning Show back in the fall. That was really great because my aunts finally understand now what I do for a living. It made Thanksgiving a lot easier. And it's growing very, very quickly. We're now at a point where we're beginning to identify what's really working well about the experience. And we're pausing growth to bring on a real A team of people to come on and figure out how do we maintain quality at rapidly growing scale. I hired the chief operations officer of the Marine Corps Special Operations Command a year ago. He was the Marine attaché to Yale while I was there. You can get 10,000 Marines in and out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Kentucky and California shouldn't be too hard, I hope. We'll see. He wouldn't say that right now that he's running the shop. And so what we're doing, again, thinking strategically about social change, is understanding that you can present a concept, you can show that it has quality, but unless your operations are scalable and your mission is to grow very quickly, you're never really going to get there. I learned that from Wendy Kopp at Teach for America and Michael Brown and Alan Casey at City Year. We've also seen some very interesting data on the program. I've partnered, with Harvard on this project. Would have done Yale. I opened the door for a while. No one walked through. There we are. Anyway, and we saw last year, interestingly, that students bias for what we would call the disagreeing other. So people who both disagree with them and are very different from them in politics and class, in kind of every category, went down significantly. Interestingly, bias toward their own group went up significantly. Taken together, we saw the program help kids treat people not like parts of groups, but like individuals with complexity and nuance, with dynamic views on the world, which was really what we were aiming for. In addition to that, too, we also saw that when kids got some space from their own tribe, they were able to vocalize some of the pressures that tribe was putting on them to say, I don't know if I really agree with everybody and everything we're saying. And I'd really like to be able to agree with you on some points and disagree with you on others and have that be okay. It's the kind of with me or against me certainty that we're really trying to work against right now. When we asked the kids about, we kind of gauged their emotional responses to hanging out with those disagreeing others. Relaxed, enthusiastic, and cheerful shot up after the exchange. We then probed on what we would call civic health. So sliding scales on things like how likely are you to vote in the next election? How likely are you to volunteer for your community? Do you care about the well-being of your community, your state, your country? After the trip, the 2 statements that shot up the most were, I have faith in my fellow Americans. It was very low to start. And I'm optimistic for the future of America, also very, very low to start. And then after we did a network analysis, we found that on average, kids made 3 new friends as a byproduct of the experience, and over 90% had 1 friend in their friend network. And the power, as my own story shows at the wedding, of a friend from a different place is enormous. The name association, when you hear Wyoming or Democrat or Republican or rich or poor coming out of the television or your wacky uncle's mouth at the holiday, you're going to think something very, very different. We found, ironically, when we interviewed most kids about the program, and that's the project Ryan is really starting to work on right now, it's not that young people have negative views of the other, it's that they don't have any view at all. They've never really considered it existed. We sent a kid from the Bronx to a fishing town in northern Massachusetts, Gloucester. And I sat with him. I said, what do you think? He said, oh, it's great. I said, well, what's so great about it? He said, well, there are people here. So what do you mean? He said, I didn't really think there'd be people here. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I thought the world was kind of, New York and some cities in Southern Connecticut. The rest was just trees. And I thought of that New Yorker cartoon where the whole world is Manhattan and there's like a little Eiffel Tower on the other side, and that's kind of it, right? Well, that kind of is, I think, the adolescent psychology on a lot of these issues. And I think the division and tension, the evidence stress among adults around these topics, whether it's their teachers or their parents or their relatives or their older friends, makes kids not necessarily passionate in one direction or the other. I think it makes most of them apathetic and pessimistic and feeling kind of hopeless. One of the big thing, disempowered, exactly. One of the big things that's really happened in the last year is the program is being pointed to more and more by economists as an opportunity to spur economic mobility. This is a lot of Raj Chetty's research on economic connectedness out of Harvard. The power of a cross-class friendship. The idea, as my grandmother said, that, it's not what you know, but who. Not to say that, suddenly they can call a lawyer at Fidelity or a banker at Fidelity and get an internship, but that they know that those people are nice to them and will host them in their home and cook them a meal, and that it's possible too, and that those places are staffed by real people too. Ryan's dad had a very interesting insight for us in the beginning. He's the director of the Center for Louisiana Studies at UL Lafayette. That he said that it's what folks from kind of this world could offer folks from the South. In a way, it's correlated slightly to what Donald Trump, I think, was able to capitalize on, is outside validation. He said, we don't feel like we count. He said, it goes like this, that count. And it's not necessarily a kind of, oh, let me endow you with loveliness, but to just chat and to be curious instead of judgmental, the Ted Lasso line, provides a great bond of connection that I think a lot of folks are worried of missing right now. The other huge area, and we're very honored to be referenced in Jonathan Haidt's new bestseller, The Anxious Generation, is mental health. I never occurred to me in the beginning, but a lot of what we're talking about is stunting the development of children. And any brain that's been deprived of these sorts of interactions in real social relationships is not growing up particularly happy, healthy, or whole. I thought in the beginning that it would be the ardent political opinion that would be the caustic enemy of the AEP trip. It's not at all. It's this guy. This becomes for teenagers the world that will show me what I want to see, that is totally under my control, or so I think, and completely comfortable for me. And if I don't want to put myself out there and engage with other people and say, hey, here's who I am. Hey, you're a little bit different. Tell me about your life. I'm going to go right back to this guy. Life is in 3D. This guy is not. And I think young people are really struggling because of it. I did a quick look before the talk tonight. Teen depression, bouts of serious depression is up among 150% among teenagers, worse among girls since 2004. 8 girls ages 10 to 14 since 2010. Suicides are up 167%. When I go around visiting exchanges today, I see way more kids who are finding an outlet for their development and mental health than anything else. There's one story, I'm often asked, anecdotes about the kids. There's one I'll tell very quickly about a boy named Matthew who grew up right up the road in Stamford, Connecticut, in a very dangerous neighborhood. His mom wouldn't let him out of the house at 7 o'clock at night for fear of what was going on outside the front door. Lovely kid, wonderful mom. And we sent Matthew to Kilgore, Texas. He had never been on an airplane before. He was so scared we had to fly, and a staff member to LaGuardia had to hold Matthew's hand as we were rocketing down the runway. I didn't bring it tonight, I should, but you should see the look on his face that once the wings caught flight and he's looking out the window, not just at the view of Manhattan below, but at the world from a whole new vantage point. And that metaphor is very apt to what we are doing at AEP. He gets there, and his distance from back home allowed him to kind of work on himself a little bit. One of our funders in Kilgore brings the kids to Cavender's, which is the local cowboy outfitter. And I don't mean like the, John Wayne Hollywood. I mean a real cowboy outfitter, and says, get whatever you want. And Matthew bought the shop. Boots, hats, belt, jeans, shirt, vest, all of it. And he, when he put on the clothes, became not Matthew, but like Tex. And Tex walked around with a little swagger and a little Gary Cooper. And he was able to find a confidence that I don't think he had walking into the program. In fact, the next day, that same kid who had never seen a cow in his life before was on the pen, smacking cows in the butt, getting them down the chute so they could get medicine and off into the pen they would go. 6 months later, Matthew was in the hospital dealing with a very serious bout with mental health issues. And he wasn't, instead of calling a therapist, he was calling the rancher in Kilgore, Texas that he worked for that day, who had become a mentor and dear friend for him. He was calling him every day to help him through that crisis. Because I think Matthew found in that rancher a version of himself that he really aspired to be and that he had a hard time being in his own. I'm not saying I want that for all of our kids, but I say that story to illustrate the power of what unlikely friendships can do and what these sorts of coming of age experiences can mean to people. Now, my own vulnerable point in life changed my life, changed my future. For the students that are involved, they've all just graduated high school, which is a symbolic way of saying they're leaving the place and the people that raised them and they're off to what's next. And what we know about the development of their beliefs is that they're going to go right to a crew that's going to probably be a lot like them. And they're going to try to fit in a form of constructing their own identity. And then by the time they're 25, their brain will be done developing physiologically. And what we're trying to do at AEP is kind of catch them after they leave the nest, but before they are off on whatever's next in the summer after senior year, and introduce a lot of diversity into their lives. Our dream is to make senior exchange as normal to the high school experience as senior prom. The team I'm putting together, what I'm building, is aimed to get to hundreds of thousands, if not a million kids within a decade. That's the goal. So everything we're doing right now is done in the name of scalability, testing, and approval. Again, here sits Ryan for that very reason. The impact gauges all the way from Matthew to a girl I met. I met last summer and I was chatting with her a few weeks ago, Maddie Castro. I said, Maddie, what did AEP mean to you? And she reached behind her laptop screen and pulled out a little friendship bracelet with, the cheap pink and yellow and red beads that kids make. And she says, I've lived in 3 different places since high school, going to different colleges and studying abroad. And this is one of the 3 things that I bring with me everywhere I go. And I, to this day, years later, never have had so many texts from all over the country on my birthday every year from my new friends. We're growing very quickly. The whole thesis of the program is that the majority of Americans are good people who, under the right circumstances, will get along with each other. And our job at AEP is to create the right circumstances. It's also the jobs of the people involved to create the right circumstances. We have 500 kids on the road this summer. We have probably 4,000 to 5,000 adults associated with running the program. That's people volunteering their time during the day, showing them around business, it's parents, it's educators we've hired in all of our classrooms running the program. So if anyone here in your own way would like to get involved, there's room for you. This is meant to be the lever you can pull to get involved in the issue that we know is causing a lot of angst right now. I told Ken I'd leave time for questions, and I'm now running afoul of not being able to live up to that promise. So I'll end my remarks there. Thank you all for coming tonight and listening to us.
Now for this, we can certainly go over time. I know there are a lot of questions. Let's start with this room first, and then we'll go to our virtual audience. Questions here.
So do you think without, if you hadn't, aside from that particular, is there something specific to Yale that allowed the birth of this? I'm assuming not just the course itself, but
Yeah.
the nature of Yale.
A great question. Yale being in New Haven, playing on the baseball team, we would take the bus from Payne Whitney to the field every day. We'd drive through the city. And that 2 communities could be so a world apart and so foreign to each other, made a huge impression on me. That the bent of the university was so toward doing something good for the world was huge. Service. That the ethos of the teachers there is to get to know your students. It didn't feel like anyone was above anyone. Harvard, they said you could step over your dead body in a quad and forget to call 911 by the time they get to their office. That had a lot to do with it. I got to get to know my teachers as people, and I understood that that you can approach people and ask questions and learn. I have no idea how to run a nonprofit. I still am only beginning to get it, but I know how to ask the right questions and find the people who probably know the answers. Again, with these 2 right here, that we're trying to figure out to get things going. And the last thing that made a huge impression on me, I don't know if you all remember, when we graduate, the dean of students approaches the president and says, I request, It's like 5,000 students to get their degrees, numbering 2,500 in Bachelor of Sciences and 2,500 in Bachelor of Arts. Science seems to be going down, arts seems to be going down, whatever. And the president says, I confer upon you these degrees and the rights and responsibilities therein. And a lot of universities say privileges. That responsibility made a great impression on me, a great impression. And I think there's something about the culture at Yale that absolutely made me want to do this, and has in no remarkable way had so many Yale people surrounding it the whole way through.
How are you planning to follow up with your alums over the course of the next decade?
Yeah.
Because the echo chamber that they step out of, it does seem like you're inoculating them in a very wonderful way. But that is a persistent echo chamber that is so tailored to the individual. It's hard to fight against it.
Yeah, well, because revenge is a dish best served cold. I'm gonna
Yes.
make this guy answer that question. Because he used to do that to me all the time in seminar class. Ryan is working with a world-renowned mediator that we work with named Adar Cohen, and he's been conducting kind of oral history project on our alumni to figure out, in essence, what's the secret ingredient that's working so well with what we're doing? What are we not doing well enough? What should we scrap? My quick answer is that we've really not touched that part of it to see what kids would do on their own in the name of being able to build what we want to build in the future. And the answer is that what they're doing on their own is a ton, and it's all very different. But yeah, Ryan's done a few interviews, and I'd love for him to share with us.
All right, so here's a quick response, and I'm still sort of on the outside looking in. So it's been fascinating to talk to alum who've gone through the program. We've interviewed people from each year, each cohort. So the first cohort had a very different experience compared to someone who did it last summer, because as the program expands, so do the options for experiences, the locations change, etc. There's several things that they say. On the one hand, this was so striking, how radically their perception shifted. I would say going into this, there's a lot of monologuing. People talk past each other. There's no discourse. What's happening now is that this experience is teaching them the art of discourse on the one hand, and where they arrive, this is not a conversion camp, but rather when they arrive at the end of the program, they can agree to disagree. We can't even do that in this country. So that's what's taking place now. In terms of the alum, what do they look like? What are we doing there? Said David, they all say, how can we be involved? How can we be more involved? It's a sleeping giant. And they are ready to go out and proselytize, and tell the world about AEP. And they're powerful stories, because it's a story of personal growth, shifting perspectives, but maturing perspectives, and people who, again, learn to make connections, because there's no way to make a connection. It's this.
Subvert the algorithm.
That's exactly.
When they friend each other, they're seeing images from places they've never seen before. And so they're staying in touch a lot. So there's a lot of just kind of good old fashioned kid friend making happening. And a lot of kind of the want for reunions to see our friends that the kids want. We don't have the money for that, or even hire. Love to. And then there's also a huge opportunity for kids who want to pursue literal kind of job or volunteer internship opportunities that would come to them naturally. That could be interning for the mayor that you shadowed for a day. It could be going to AmeriCorps, who we work a lot with. So there's all sorts of opportunities that we're trying to coalesce around the program. Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Hold on, Victoria. We've got John Bacon. John, go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to say this all resonates very well with me. Back when I was a student in Palos Verdes, to bring Southern California back into the conversation, we had math Olympiads, and we met students from all over the Southland, especially from Roosevelt High School. And that was almost like an exchange. Inner city school, smart gals, and they were all gals in my memory. And two of them ended up being Yale classmates. great. So I think even intercity, interregional exchanges may be valuable. Maybe you do that already. And again, I'm the AFS guy, but we have 75 years of this more on a foreign thing. But just be aware that the Department of State funded exchange programs are under fire right now by Congress. And I won't say anything more about it politically, but it's very, very, very sad because that's a big part of our program and a big part of how this is all working internationally at this point. Thus, the focus on domestic makes good sense and you guys are doing great. So keep it up.
Thanks, John. Yeah, it's been, you know, we got a grant to do policy strategy for AEP, and it's been wonderful the amount of support we've gotten from both sides of the aisle, but it's a tough time to do anything in DC right now. We found a lot of traction with governors, interestingly, and the reason I'm on the way out to Oregon is not only to explore getting them involved in the national program at the state level, but also to figure out if we can do intra-Oregon exchanges, Portland area to these areas that are voting to secede. It's the rural communities that are stepping up first and saying we'd really love to do the program. So yeah, I think there's a big opportunity there, John. You know, we have a lot of interesting ideas like this, and part of why I'm working so hard to bring on a great team of people in experience design and in operations especially, is to figure out how we can do more of what we're doing well right now, and then also, probably not the best word for it, but like mutate a version of what we're doing to fit other entities. So like the SUNY system in New York wants to do exchanges within the SUNY system as an orientation activity for freshmen, working with AmeriCorps programs to do exchanges as part of your year of service. And this is all experience design. It's all partnerships we can do. So part of the opportunity for scale is to take this notion of exchange and really proliferate it across a lot of different entities. It's what the EU does. It's why hundreds of thousands of European students every year go on all sorts of different exchanges, and they umbrella fund the whole thing. And again, that gets back to my earlier point about thinking strategically about scale, growth, and impact has really been what's created opportunities off of the success we're having.
I think a lot about religion. I'm a complete atheist from Los Angeles, transplant. But I see that as such a huge part of the reproductive freedom problem. And I just was wondering, in all of this, were there evangelicals, you know, the ones that delivered South to Trump, were they vocal, or is it really their parents who care about that and they really?
You know, it's so interesting. The America I see on the television is not the one I see traveling around the country 2.5 weeks a month. I think it's because our program is definitely attracting the silent middle. You know, this chasm has opened up in our society, and I think we're listening to very vocal minorities on either side of the canyon. I think the vast majority of Americans are dismayed, confused, and somewhere in the middle. Good old Boston atheist myself growing up, married a Catholic also from the Boston area who wanted to get married in a church and broke to me that I would need to get baptized for that to happen. And I you know, open to religion, but I love my wife. Loved her when she was my fiance, expected my girlfriend to. And so I called my the pastor in Kilgore, Texas, who's on our board, and I am now officially a member of the First Baptist Church of Kilgore, Texas. My impression of the issue that you're talking about is that it varies a lot based on age, no matter where you are. And that the people swaying the decisions of their congregation, who really care only about their congregation and not their own popularity or political persuasion, you know, the example I think of the 10 Commandments being pushed into classrooms in Louisiana is another example, not of the whole state of Louisiana, but of how, for whatever reason, children in classrooms have become the tip of the political spear right now for politicians trying to gain a lot of headway. Tell you a story about Oklahoma and something we're running into there later. And so I think for those that care truly about their congregations, they have no idea how to navigate these differing opinions and issues. And this issue of how do we talk to each other? How do we live together? How do we find the compromise that is there if you can handle the conversation right? Is one where people don't even know where to begin. And I think it's because the spotlight is so being focused on how starkly divided we are, and not really being focused on how we should be talking to each other better. Absolutely, I've run into people who approach our program with no open ears at all, and they feel they're in a culture war, and the way you win a culture war is by winning. Almost everybody I've talked to for whom that's true, and it's usually about 2% of the people I meet, have selfish aims to climb a political ladder. And it seems like they are adopting the script they feel they need to say to be popular in the moment. And if it's actually what they believe, I don't really know. Yeah. Don't know if that totally answers your question.
If I could say this, though, evangelical religious communities is a different type of algorithm. And to disrupt that algorithm it's very difficult to do, because you are either in or you're out. It's a very stark line.
Endogamy, exogamy.
That's exactly what.
And the kicker
That's any
too,
kind of, that's the Orthodox Jews as well as the whole.
yeah, and the reason we're working with kids is because they're way more open-minded than their parents. And when we looked at adult programs, we just realized that for the masses, we just wouldn't get there. For a kid, changing their mind is that. For an adult, 7 years old, it's turning around an aircraft carrier at a moment's notice. They've been thinking about it forever. So, and we found a kind of different way in, and all of what we're doing is really meant to be a first step. It's meant to be a quick, scalable process.
So are you guys writing research papers out of this and presenting in academic journals or other conferences and things like that?
Yeah, so really, Ryan and Adar are going to be, Adar is the mediator, are going to be working on a research paper off of their work with AEP. The quantitative side of our impact is really handled by Harvard and now a partner at Cal Berkeley. And then we're really investing with Ryan and Adar in a qualitative impact. And the express purpose of that is for them to understand how we can be more scalable. Very technical side. We're building out ops, marketing, technology, and experience design. And I'm doing this off of a lot of programs, examples that have scaled very rapidly. Just focus really 2 years on not actually growing very much. We're really not going to add many more students, but on focusing how we can be more efficient and scalable in what we do, and how we can tackle the ultimate challenge and things like this, which is how do you maintain quality at increasing quantity.
And in terms of timetable, so you get some sense, Friday is my last day in the Yale College Dean's office. So it's only just starting.
You're actually moving over to work full-time, so on source.
Yale part-time.
Is this grant funded, this particular project, or?
We're working on that part of it, yeah.
I have to ask as an executive director, former executive director, what is your guys' biggest need as an organization right now?
Combination, well, right now it's not host families, but any other time of year, usually it's host families. Absolutely, it's funding. And it's really a strategic funding to understand how we can scale. I've got probably 15 governors across the country that if we have the people power to really advance it, would be advancing legislation to go statewide. There's going to be keep it here. There's a line item in the North Carolina budget to start a process to scale AEP statewide in the state of North Carolina. I'm doing the same thing. I don't have the national staff right now to figure out how to leverage that. If 10,000 kids show up tomorrow, our problem wouldn't be what to do with them. It would be just the core leadership in each department to handle that kind of increased load. And we are absolutely keeping a lid on scaling right now. We brought on no new schools last year. Well, sorry, no net place schools that had to drop for one reason or another. No net new schools, and we invested not another dollar in marketing, and our program doubled in size in a year. So what I'm trying to do right now is recruit funders who are kind of in for the long game and are willing to invest to build the program. Now, that doesn't need to be a massive investment. Our largest funder is the Heartland Foundation, whose principals are Kate Capshaw and Steven Spielberg. But there are small strategic investments we can make, like in this research project, that would tremendously advance the nature of the work that we are doing, because it allows us to see what we're doing well, not distract ourselves with practices in our program that we shouldn't be doing, and get it to go.
Okay, 2 last questions. I want to make sure the virtual audience has a shot. Peter, why don't you go, and then Josiah?
Yes, I put this in the chat, but as I've been listening to this, it does sound kind of like the educational equivalent of the organization Braver Angels. Have you had a chance to cross paths with that group?
Sure, I know them very well. Yep. We worked with Braver Angels from the beginning. I was on their podcast, I think, a few years ago, and know Kieran and April and all the folks there. Yeah. And yeah, we're absolutely kind of in the same solar system as Great Range.
Okay, I thought that, but I wanted to confirm it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, last question, Josiah, please.
Thank you, Ken. And congratulations, David, to you and your team on all the progress. I posted this in the chat as well, but I assume you hadn't seen it. And I wondered to what extent you're bringing people together across not only regions, but also generations in the way that Yale graduate Mark Friedman's Co-Generate organization does.
Yeah. No, I've had a few chances to chat with Mark about this very thing. We're not sending adults on trips. However, every AEP student that travels connects with 30 other people on average, 20 of whom are adults. And those adults are the people who, the friendships are generally kid to kid, but the power of becoming someone's Mississippi mom or, New York dad is, I think, just as great. And if you were to look at the ripple effect of impact, and Ryan will probably have some better observations about this in August, the first group of folks that are hit are the parents of the kids and the host parents of the kids. So there's a huge intergenerational aspect of the community-based part of the exchange that the kids are doing. And that level of connection is enormous. And that reframing of how we ought to approach people who are different from us, it takes a village to raise a kid, there's no such thing as someone else's children, is an orientation that brings about a very civil and healthy mindset toward the work that we're doing. But it's a huge question. It's a big part of the program to get as many adults involved as possible. My hope is that part of the ritual will be, we want this to be like a rite of passage for students in this country. And my hope is that part of the ritual will be kids saying, yippee yahoo, I'm a senior, I get to go on a free trip. And it'll be parents saying, oh gosh, here we go, our kid's a senior, we're hosting a kid from some godforsaken place this summer. And then they have a wonderful time. And we now see kids, going to the weddings of the older siblings of their new friends in Montana and New Jersey. And we see kids kind of commandeering a family vacation and saying, we're not going to Italy anymore, we're going on a road trip to Texas. And parents meeting one another, exchange managers meeting parents. It's kind of all this everywhere we go.
I'll just throw in one thing. I was absolutely taken by this one comment from a girl who participated last summer from Palo Alto, California. She went to rural Texas, and I asked her, I said, if you had one more day on your exchange, what would you have done? She said, I'd spend that day with my host mother. She said, I learned so much from her, and it was such a bond. And a lot of it was about politics. A lot of it was about lifestyle. A lot of it was about, why do you think this way? Right. But there is absolutely an intergenerational dynamic that's powerful.
We lost a kid one year. I shouldn't say that, but we lost a kid. And it turned out that his host family had kidnapped him from the activity because he really wanted to go sailing, and they were mad that they wouldn't have more time with him before he left.
Okay, so on that upbeat note, how about a big hand for David?
Thanks for joining online.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much. Great talk.
States are you in right now?
36. Yeah, and we're in
36 divided by the 500.